Hi, this is Robin, and in this video I'm going to be focusing on refining selections in Photoshop using the Select and Mask tools inside the Select and Mask interface in Photoshop. I've already recorded two other parts to this series on refining selections. In the first one I looked at and talked about and demoed the Quick Selection tool. In the second part of the series I focused on the Quick Mask, and as I say here, this is going to be focused on the Select and Mask tools and interface. Select and Mask is really ideal if you have much more detailed, very fine detail, delicate detail types of selections because the tools in there really let you get into all the nooks and crannies that those kinds of objects have, more so than the tools that I demonstrated in part 1 and part 2. So let me just get started here, and with the first image that I'm going to work with to demonstrate how to work with the Select and Mask tools. And it is this woman with this very curly hair. And let me zoom in a little bit so you can see all the details in her hair. Before I work on it, as usual, I'm going to duplicate the layer. And just for a refresher for anybody who hasn't seen my other videos, my toolbar is positioned here. My layers panel is right up here at the top, and the properties panel is located down at the bottom. So hopefully you can translate depending on where your tools are based. But this is a perfect kind of an example of where the Select and Mask interface and tools would be a really good type of alternative or option to use. She's got tons of little detail here in her hair, but she's also got a mix of on her body, just very smooth detail. But I'm going to stay mostly focused on her hair because that's where it's most challenging. Now, it's always great in these demos when somebody takes a shot of somebody that was done on a studio backdrop, in this case, just a plain white background, and does these things. And then when you try to do it yourself, you say, well, great, but my pictures aren't on a studio backdrop. So I'm going to show this image here for if you are doing studio shots and have complex details. I'm also going to show another demo image that's on a busier background and more of the kind of thing that a lot of people might shoot themselves. So again, to get started with this, what I'm going to do is just first make a selection because I need to do that before I can refine the selection. So using the device subject, select subject, that's how I'm going to do the initial selection. You can see that Photoshop now has made a selection. I hope you can see it with all the detail in her hair, but around her entire body are the marching ants that are used to indicate a selection in Photoshop. And marching ants is just a term that's used for these animated dashed lines. So we've got a selection now. Now the whole purpose of this is to start demonstrating how to refine selections. So to refine the selection, we're going to go to the top of the interface. I've got my object selection tool active in my toolbar, and I think this should work with any of the selection tools, but I usually have that at the top, so that's active. And then in the options bar, for that tool and for the selection tools is a Select and Mask button, and that's what I'm going to left click on. And now we're taken into the Select and Mask interface. Okay, so just to kind of give you a quick tour of this interface, we have a series of tools over here on the left side of the interface that we can use to refine selections. The top one is a quick selection tool, and in my first video I showed how to use the quick selection tool as a method to refine selections, so you could use it inside the Select and Mask interface too if you want to. The second tool here is the Refine Edge brush, and I'm going to show that in a moment. The third tool down is a brush tool, so if you end up with big blocks of area that you just want to get rid of, you can alternate between plus and minus to get rid of that. So as you can see in the center, my highlighter here is a circle. That circle is the brush. And the plus is active now, so that's what we could do to add to a selection. If we want to take away from a selection, you press the Alt or Option key, and that changes to a minus, and you have to keep it depressed when you use that. The next tool down is the same as what we launched into this interface with, which is the object selection tool. So if there's big chunks of content that were missed in the selection that we want to bring back, then we could just circle around them with the object selection tool. You can also use the lasso tool. This hand just lets you maneuver around in the interface. On the opposite side over here, what we have is a view mode. So I have mine, typically what I use to do selections, and you saw this in my earlier video too for refining selections that I used for the quick mask tool, is I like to use it in overlay mode, and that's what I have it on right now. So the overlay is the masked area. The other view mode I like to use and will often use is the black and white, because that's forming what's going to be a mask for my selection. So I get to sort of get a preview of how the mask for my selection is going to look. If you're doing a lot of compositing work, you may want to try using your selection on layers. I don't have another layer that I'm going to put behind this in my layer stack, so nothing's going to show up here. Personally, I prefer to just use overlay and then add my layers later and do it in that manner, rather than having them on here to start. But you can experiment for yourself and see what you prefer. Now for the overlay, and I just click up here to get out of that view mode, I typically do not have these boxes checked, but you can see the edges of your selection if you click on Show Edge. The opacity refers to how opaque or translucent your overlay is. So again, I've picked this pink color because I rarely have it in my images, and I have it in around 50–55%. So that's what that refers to. Refine mode, for something like this with the hair and all the details, object aware is very helpful to use, and that helps to distinguish the edges the best. If you have very distinct color differences between your foreground and the area you want in your background that you want to mask it from, then color aware might be a better option for you. But for this and something with there's a lot of details like this, object aware works really well. The next area down here in the interface is edge detection. And what I'll often do is pull my radius up to somewhere between 3 and 4 pixels. And the radius basically tells you how far from the subject's edges Photoshop should refine the mask. So it's better not to go too far with that, but you can experiment for your image and see if it helps you. I used to use Smart Radius a lot in earlier generations of Photoshop. I haven't used it quite as much lately, but if you want to click on Smart Radius, that could help when you have a variety of edges in your image. So if some are pretty straight and others are really messy, then Smart Radius will help you to figure out what is what and which to use, what kind of edges to use in which parts of your image. Next are the global refinements. So this smooth slider, I don't adjust these till later, and I use them very, very little and very, very low if I use them at all. So the smooth slider is great for smoothing edges in Photoshop. I use that also in one of my other videos. I think it was the one for the quick selection tool. And the mask I got had little jaggedy edges, so I used this smooth slider to slide them out. The feather slider, the next one down, is good for sort of softening edges. So if you're going to be adding your selection to a collage, it can really help to just make it a little less harsh, to blend in with your collage a little better. So again, very subtle use, always in very small increments, and you can try that and see how that works. Contrast is kind of the opposite, so that's going to harden your edge. So if you need a really hard edge and it's a little bit too blurry and soft in your mask, then try contrast. And then shift edge will either move the edge of your selection inwards if you go to the negative side, or outwards if you go to the positive side. So if your edge has gone a little bit too much outside, what I recommend doing is feather a little bit, just a very little bit. You can sort of come up to like so far here, like I don't know, maybe to 3 or 4, and then try shifting your edge and then moving your feather back down to a very subtle number, very low. So if you're going to try to use shift edge, try to use it in conjunction with feather, because I think it will help you refine your selections better. And then the final thing that we have down here at the bottom, and I'm not going to use it right now until we're finished, are your output settings. And typically I output to not a selection, but to a new layer with layer mask. And I like to do that because, first of all, I never like to overwrite a layer, so I like to go onto a new layer with any kind of selections or selection refinements. And then with the mask, you get 2 for 1 with that, because not only do you get a mask that you can use and reuse and copy to or move to other layers, but then by having that you also can regenerate your selection by using the control and clicking on the mask. So I like to use new layer with layer mask as my output method. Okay, so coming back to this image, as you remember, she was shot on a pure white background, and we've got her on an overlay now here, as I mentioned, and we can see that there are some remnants of the white background behind her hair, even just by selecting subject. So selecting subject, as you can see in Photoshop, has gotten better and better, and it already, even with this really intricate, very fine detailed subject, it made a very good selection. But there are bits and pieces that it did not pick up, and where it's white is still got remnants of the background. So what we're going to try here, because she does have hair and it's very intricate, is go up to the top of the interface and try clicking on this refine hair. So I'm going to left click on the refine hair and watch some of these places where there's white background and see if this helps that. So let's click on refine hair, and you can see it already did a tremendous cleanup on this. So up in here, down in some of these areas, over in some of these areas, a lot of the white background has gone away already. So there's not a lot of extra work to do here. To try to get rid of the little bits of residual background that are still here, so there's some dots here, there's a little bit here, I'm going to use the Refine Edge brush, which is the second tool from the top. See, right, Refine Edge. It's the brush with, I don't know, it looks like it's got a little hand or something there right next to it. Now I'm going to keep my brush not too big. So again, the highlighter so you can see where I am is not my brush. That black circle inside that highlighter is my brush. So I'm going to come down. And what I'm going to do is, when I use Refine Edge and Refine Edge brush to refine a selection, I click in a solid area near where I want to brush over the area to be refined. And I'm just going to click and drag, but I'll click first in a solid area and then just drag. And see the pink that came up? Do it again, there's a little white here. I'm going to click in the solid area and then drag over where the selection needs to be refined. I'm going to click here and drag over where the selection needs to be refined. And you can see we're picking up more of the pink overlay and getting rid of the original white background. Down here there's another one where I click and drag. And let's see, this might be. The thing I recommend is, if you get a decent edge, don't overdo it. Don't mess with it, because I think that you can typically do more damage by continuing to play with it than by going with something that looks pretty good like this. And again, I've got my radius at around 3. We can maybe try up to 4 and see if that helps anything, but I think it's doing a really good job. Here's another piece of the white background. I'm going to click in the solid part of the hair and then just brush over, and you can see how it then picks up the background that it didn't get. There's some more white over here. There's some more white here, so click in the solid, pulling down. There's some more here, some more here, and there's a little piece here. And I don't go too far. I try to make very small movements and stay localized to where I'm doing the refining selection. And as I said, I don't do too big of a brush. Let me come up a little bit. I'm using my bracket keys, left and right brackets, to enlarge and reduce the size of the brush. Okay. Now, when we get down to her collar here, all right, that's a different kind of thing, and that's a little bit smoother. So remember when we were doing the smoother kind of refining, and in fact, I'm just going to grab a little bit more of this right here. Okay. When we were doing the smoother refining in the earlier demo, I believe it was the first demo on using the quick selection tool, it had smoother edges in that selection, so the quick selection tool was a really good way to try to fix that. So I'm going to do the same thing here. The quick selection tool is the top brush. I'm just hovering over that. That's the brush with the little dashed line coming out of it. And then I'm going to come over, make my brush a little bit bigger. And you can see I'm going to make it a little bigger than I want it right now, so you can see there's a plus sign in it. So because the full selection was not selected, I want to be able to push this edge back out to the edge of her collar. If the pink part is showing that it's overlaid onto the selection should be revealed, so we need to add to the selection. I'm going to make that brush a little smaller again, and because it's a plus, I'm just going to start painting. There we go. And not too far again. We don't want the brush or the center of the brush to go much over the edge of the selection. So we've captured that. So at this point, I'm feeling pretty good about how we've been able to refine this selection, first using the Refine Edge brush and then the Quick Selection tool. Okay, so now, as I said, I like to, in my view mode, go over here and click to see how this looks as a mask. And look at, we've gotten tons and tons of detail here, so I'm feeling pretty good about this as a selection. So I'm going to put this back to my overlay mode, come down to the bottom where I showed you the output settings right here, and we're going to output to, and as I said, you can choose another one of the options in there if you want a selection or a new document or whatever, but I definitely prefer new layer with layer mask, and I'm going to click OK. All right, so now we're back into the Photoshop interface. We've come out of select and mask, we're back into Photoshop, and we've back on our layer, and let me just label this. So this is refined selection. Okay. And if we look, we should see on this mask that it looks very much like what we saw in the select and mask interface. So that's why I like to use that. Now, in order to see if we got a good selection, what I usually like to do is to put a solid fill color under my selection so I can see the edges better. So what I'm going to do, I'm just looking and thinking to myself here what color I want to use. So given the colors here, I think I'm going to use a bright color like a yellow. So I'm going to come down to the bottom of my layers panel, to the Add Adjustment layer, which is the circle with the line through it, and left click on that, and I'm going to pick a solid color. All right, so I want a fill color, and as I said, maybe a bright yellow might look good with her. All right, let's try this and see how it looks. All right, so obviously this is covering your selection, but what we need to do is drag it down below the selection so that we can see it through here. Okay, so I'm going to just drag it right down to there, and there we go. So we've got our woman selected, so that's the white, and we've got the back on the background on the image, which is the white hidden. So now we're seeing her on yellow. And let me get rid of this so we can just see this selection. So this is looking really good to me here. Let me try something else. If it doesn't work, we'll see. Sometimes when you make selections, it'll thin out your object that you're working with. And one way to deal with that and to make it thicker or restore some of the bulk to it is to just duplicate the layer. So let's see if that helps with this or not. So I'm taking this layer with the selection, the refined selection, and I'm dragging it down to my add layer icon, which is the square with the plus in it. And let me just look at this for a minute and see. Okay, so I'll turn off that color background just to see. Here she is. Oh yeah, so that's, if you like it with her hair a little thicker, I do, then that's an instance where it really looks good by duplicating that layer. So I think we've done a really good kind of a selection for her. And I would say let's just stop there because that really looks good to me. We've got all of the details in her hair. We're not seeing the white from the background. And by adding this duplicate layer, we've added some nice thickness to her hair. It hasn't thinned out her hair by trying to get rid of the original background. So I'm going to say that that is the first example, and if you want I can make this smaller too so we can see it's selected all of her in the process of doing these selections. So if you want to put her on a completely different background, you can do that. I'm not going to bring in, because this isn't a compositing lesson, but you could bring in a background to go behind her just as well as you could bring in a color. So you can see she's selected well enough that she will fit and go onto another background without bringing her original background with her. Okay, so there we go. So that's the first example of how to use select and mask, and that was after we made an initial selection, then we went into select and mask. So I had the selection tool active, I clicked on select subject, and then after we got the mask, the selection rather, from Photoshop, we went into the select and mask interface to do the refining. Okay, so now let's try another image to see if we can refine a selection on this. Again, let me just duplicate the layer before I do anything. Okay, so I promised you that we would do a little bit more complicated background because you don't always have a nice perfectly clean image that you need to make a selection of and that you need to make refinements of. So something like this, there's two different ways you can approach it. So as I said in my initial selections video, it really depends what you're going to use your selection for, how much time you want to spend making the selection and refining the selection. If all you want to do is maybe add a little more color to this lion, if all you want to do is maybe add a little more contrast or something of that nature, a little more, I don't know, sharpening, you don't need to spend forever making a selection or refining a selection. You can make a very quick selection and make those kinds of layer adjustments, and it's not going to matter. You don't need to worry about that. But if you want to take this lion and put him into another make a composite with him by putting him into another image or a collage and put him in together with other images, if you want to take him, let's say he was in a bigger background and you wanted him to be in someplace else in your image, then you'd have to select him very carefully and very well and make sure you get all the details in order to be able to move him without bringing his background with him. So it's important to know right up front what you want to do before you make your selection. This is all prelude to me saying, I'm going to pretend that I want to make a composite with him and I want to put him in another image. So I want to completely remove him from this background. With that in mind, what I will very often do for something like this is before I even start making the selections, I'll get rid of some details in the image that might be confusing to Photoshop when it tries to make selections or refine them. So in this case, I'm going to use my, if I can get it working here, spot healing brush. Okay. And I'm just going to come over and I'm going to first zoom in a little bit and get rid of some distracting elements that are around the lion for to take them out of this picture, because I wouldn't be using this background in this hypothetical situation anyway. So let me just get rid of some of these things that might be confusing to Photoshop. I'm just using the spot healing brush to get rid of things. And no matter what your image is, if there's something complicated and you have lots of details around it and you're not going to use your background, you might want to think about doing something like this too. I don't want to come too far because I don't want to distort his tail. Okay, I think that's enough stuff out of that area. This is light, so I don't want it to get confused with his body. All right, and I'm just going to grab some of this because he's got whiskers over there. So okay, so I think that's enough cleanup. I mean, it's about the level of cleanup I would typically do if I want to use this, make a selection and not use the background. The other thing I have to look at in this image, and ideally you'd get rid of this too, but I'm not going to worry about that because I don't want to distort the tail. The other challenge in this image, and I'm trying to purposely show you a challenging image so that if you get something like this, you'll know what to do. So the mane that he has is really kind of nice here, except for here. It's against a really kind of dark background and he's starting to blend into his background, which makes it difficult for Photoshop and you to distinguish where the edges are to make a selection. So we talked about this in another video too for my refining selections, and that was to go down to the bottom of your layers panel, go to the add adjustment layer icon, the circle with the slash through it, and come down to levels and left click on levels, and we get a levels layer here. And what we want to do is in the properties panel, look at the histogram, and again, depending on what your image has in it, you have to adjust it either darker or lighter. But I want to make this a little lighter with this lion so that he stands out better from the dark background. So you're going to have to gauge for your own image that you're going to be working with whether you want your item that you're selecting to be darker or lighter, depending on your background. So again, histogram, quick review, the blacks are at the left, the midtones are in the center, and the whites are at the right. So I want to pull this slider to the left and watch the lion as I do this, and don't worry because I'm doing this as a temporary measure, so it's not going to stay like this. So he's got much cleaner, brighter edges. In this even lightened up a little bit. I'm going to take his midtones to the left a little bit too. There we go. So we have some more edges. Okay, so now with that, I'm going to come back to my lion layer because this is going to be a temp. I'm going to just type on this so you can remember here. This is a temp level. Okay, come back to the lion, and now instead of starting and making a selection while we're still here in the Photoshop interface, we're going to skip that step and go directly to select and mask. So this is more direct than what we did in the last example with the woman with the curly hair. So click on that. All right, now we're back in our select and mask interface again, because you recognize that I've got my pink overlay. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Okay. And we've got our select subject button up here, and we've got refine button up here. So this time we are going to select subject in select and mask. So let's try that and see how that goes. You can see the little activity in the highlighter. It says that a selection's being made. Okay, so Photoshop has made a selection and it's already captured a lot of the hair and the little fine hairs in this mane. So I'm pretty happy with that. Let's try clicking on refine hair, because again, it could be hair. It doesn't matter that it's on an animal. Let's try it and see. Yeah, so did you see that? Let's see if I can go back a step. Watching some of these areas here where it's a little blocked up. Now, some of this we might not be able to get rid of because it's just the background is just such that we can do that. Let's just click refine hair and look up in here and see if anything happens. Yeah, see, so it really has refined the hair. Yeah, see it, and this is what happens. It's difficult for it to work with something like that, and that's why I get rid of the distractions. Okay, so we have, I'm going to say, given how this came out, I don't want to mess with this because, as I said before, if you mess with delicate selections, you might make more of a mess of things. So let's just not even mess with the hair. So I'm going to come to the quick selection tool again, and I'm going to stay with a relatively small brush. I'm going to make this a little bigger so I can see a little closer here. And I want to take away from this, so I'm going to press my Alt. It would be Option on a Mac, and I'm going to just gently start pushing here because I'm trying to take away from where the selection sprawled out into the background. Make my brush a little bit smaller. Again, switch to the minus key because I'm taking away from where it sprawled. Okay, so now we're back to where we want to be on the tail. I hesitate to do this, but I'm hitting minus and I'm going to try to get away a little bit, there we go, of the grasses. And there's a little bit here. There we go. Let's see if we can get rid of that. There we go. And so I'm still on this quick selection tool with the minus. All right, the quick selection tool is the one on the top. All right, let's see what else we've got. So this little area in here wasn't selected. So this is still part of the background. So again, another place we need to minus because we want to hide the background. So hide means not show, means minus, subtract. So again, press the Alt or the minus or the Option key and just gently either mouse, or ideally you'd be doing this, I have a mouse right now, which is not the best thing. I typically work with a stylus and a tablet. So let me see if I can get this to be a little bit more refined. Okay, so we want to add to the selection because it took away too much from the selection. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time refining this, but I think you get the gist that if you have an area, you might need to go back and forth a few times with the plus and the minus, possibly using the quick selection tool. If it really goes wide, then you can use your brush tool, which is the third one down, with the plus or minus to try to get it. And always do things like what I'm doing where I'm zooming way in so I can see better what I'm working with. And again, since for purposes of this demo, you're just trying to learn how to use the tool, so I don't need to make a perfectly refined selection. I would spend the time if I was doing this for a real situation. Okay. Let's take away from this. And this is trickier because this is getting in among. We're going to probably lose some hairs here in the process, and that's why I said to don't mess around too much. But I think that's pretty good. It looks like the ones that are the dark white have been picked up, and these we're probably going to lose, but it's not worth fooling around and potentially messing things up, especially on a really busy background like that. The evil secret is that professional retouchers probably wouldn't even do what I'm doing here. They would crop in on the edges, and then they would spend the time, because they're being paid for it, and they'd use brush tools, and once they got this back into Photoshop, they'd be brushing in little hairs and they'd be faking it. So for those of you who aren't going to be doing this for a living and just need to work with tools to get them to operate good enough, or really maybe more than good enough, then something like this is going to work just fine. So I'm going to call this good. Again, I want to output to a new layer with layer mask and click OK. Alright, so now we're back in the layer stack in Photoshop. I'm going to turn off this temporary level because we certainly didn't want him looking all warped like that. And you can see we've ended up with a pretty nice selection here. And maybe I can try putting him on a background too and see how he looks. So let me, on his layer, go to the add adjustment layer, add a solid layer. I don't want to use a tan. Well, maybe the same thing we were using before, something like that. Or a purple. How's that? Let's see how that looks. Okay, let's pull that below him so we can see what we got here. Maybe that's a little bit too dark to see because he's dark. Let me try a lighter pink. Here we go, that's better. Okay, so we can see that with him on this lighter layer, first of all, let's see if, I'm going to throw this out because we don't need that, that was temporary. If the same thing that we did for the woman's hair helps with him or if it doesn't help. So I'm going to click on him on this lion layer and drag it down to the bottom of the layers panel to the add layer icon, which is the box with the plus in it. And I think it did fill in a little more. Let me turn that off and see. Yeah, no, it thickens some of the hair. So I like that it is doing that. Now let's try something else. And I'm going to just duplicate this one more time just so if we play and we don't like it, I can get rid of it. So remember in one of the other videos, I showed you that under the layer menu, so up at the upper left of your Photoshop interface, there is, down at the bottom of that menu, is something called matting. And let's pull to the right and try color decontamination and see if what we're seeing there are some of the colors from his original background. And yeah, that's helping to get rid of that. So I think that helped. So let's click OK. I think that helped. Yeah, see, look at that. Okay, when I click it off and then on, you can see that's done some decontamination. Let's try something else here. The other thing I see on this lion is that there is some fringing, so this black line that's going along his back and down his tail. I'm going to try something else here as a further selection refinement. and see if that will help with the fringing that remains. So what I'm going to do is look over here and just see what we've got. So here's the first layer that we did some work on. Yeah, so if I turn that off, I'm getting rid of some more color contamination. So I'm going to leave that off. And yeah, see, that helps with the hair, and that helps with the hair. So what I am going to do is merge these two top layers so that we're getting the benefit of not a lot of color contamination, but we're getting the fullness of the lion's mane. So to do this, I have the top layer active. I'm going to press the Shift key, and I'm going to click on the layer below, so the two active eyes. There we go. And now I'm going to go up to my little hamburger menu. So in yours it may be down at the bottom. So in the Layers panel, go to the little hamburger menu. That's the little lines there. Left click on that, and I'm going to click on Merge Layers. So those two highlighted layers will become one. See? There we go. So now we have the benefit of getting what was accomplished on those two layers on a single layer. Now I'm going to try to hit Control. I think on a Mac it would probably be Command, and click on him. And we've reactivated our selections. You can see the marching ants. And then I'm going to go to the bottom of the Layers panel and click on the Add Layer Mask icon, which is the rectangle with the circle. And we've got our mask again for this layer. Now with this layer mask active, so in other words the white frame has to be around it to show that it's active, I'm going to go over to the filter menu at the top of the Photoshop interface, click on that, and come down to where it says Other. So right below all these different artistic filters, Other, and then come to the flyout menu to the right and go down to Minimum and click on that word Minimum, and you'll get this pop-up box. And what Minimum does is it's a good way to modify masks. So you do have to have the mask active to work on it. And what the minimum filter does essentially is it chokes or it shrinks the area of the mask where it's white, and then spreads out the black areas by some specified area that we can state right here in terms of the radius. If you were to use the other option, which was maximum, it would do the opposite. We also need to hit a preserve option. So in this case, because this is a lion, it's an animal, it's soft and it's got soft edges, I'm going to choose roundness. The other option is squareness. You would choose squareness if you wanted to use this minimum approach of choking the mask. If it was a geometric or a perfectly hard-edged kind of an object that you were working with, but for this kind of subject we definitely want to stay with roundness. So the more we move this radius up, the more it's going to choke the white areas or the visible areas of the mask. So I want to do this just very gradually, and because we don't want to overdo it or it'll take away content. So let's see what we've got here. So we still have a little bit of a line showing there. Went away by 1.7, so let's see. Let's try maybe 5. Nope, it's still there. 1.6 gets rid of it. So by choking the white area of the mask and spreading out the black area, we're minimizing it, the mask, and now it's getting rid of that fringing along his back and tail. So we're going to click OK on that. And that now looks really good in terms of what we were able to select of the lion and still keep the hair on his mane, keep the textural elements of him, and not have any noticeable fringing. So if you want to put him into another image or another composite or move him around on a larger image, you can do that with this kind of a selection. So we've gotten a number of ways to refine selections in this video using the select and mask interface, launching from either originally using one of the selection tools and select subject, or having one of the selection tools active and going directly into select and mask, and then making revisions with tools inside the select and mask interface. Then we also were able to go into the layer menu and make some refinements to the mask with matting, and also go into the filter menu down to other and make some revisions to the mask with minimum. Now again, as I said, in some cases you might want to try maximum if what you actually want to do is expand out. In this case, we wanted to shrink in and get rid of some of that black that was fringing from the background. So that is the final piece of this third video on refining selections in Photoshop using the Select and Mask interface. Hope it will help you in your projects, and looking forward to talking with you again soon.